Caleb Morgan stood in the middle of Silver Creek's main street with his hat in both hands and said the words he believed would end everything. "I have nothing to offer your daughter, sir. No land, no money, no name worth speaking." He expected the door to close. He expected silence or shame. What he got instead broke something open inside his chest that had been locked for 11 years. Because Walter Bennett looked at him for a long moment and smiled, not with pity, but with something that looked almost like relief. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1885 came to Silver Creek, Wyoming, like a man with a grudge, hot and relentless and unforgiving from the first morning light. The kind of heat that made horses pin their ears and men say things they regretted. The kind that settled into the mountain passes and stayed pressing down on the valley below, like a hand that refused to lift. Caleb Morgan had ridden down from the high timber 2 days before with a week's worth of dust on his coat and a job completed that nobody had asked him to report on. He'd spent 11 days alone above the tree line tracking a cut in the northern fence line that had been bleeding cattle off the Hargrove spread for the better part of a month. He'd found it repaired, it counted what he could count, and ridden back down without ceremony. He didn't stop at the saloon. He didn't look for anyone to tell. He rode to the livery, settled his horse, paid what he owed, and walked to the rooming house on the far end of Meridian Street. The cheap end, the quiet end, and slept for 14 hours. That was how Caleb Morgan operated. He had done it that way for 11 years, since the night everything that mattered to him burned to the ground in a high country fire and left him standing in a field with nothing but the clothes on his back and a grief so large he had no language for it. He had been 24 years old then, young enough that people expected him to rebuild, old enough that he understood what rebuilding actually cost. He had chosen a different path, not a lesser one, just quieter. He worked, he moved, he didn't attach. He told himself that was enough. The morning after he came back down from the high timber, Caleb walked to the general store for coffee and dried beans and found the town of Silver Creek in the particular kind of uproar that only happened when money was involved. 3 men stood on the steps of the land office talking loud enough that the whole street could hear. Caleb recognized 2 of them, Richard Hayes, who owned the largest consolidated spread in the valley, and his foreman, a narrow-shouldered man named Dodd, who had the habit of speaking for his employer before his employer had finished thinking. The third man he didn't know, but he knew the type. City coat, clean boots, the particular stillness of someone who had come a long distance for a reason and wasn't going to be moved off it easily. Caleb bought his coffee and his beans and his tobacco and came back out onto the steps and stood to the side while the men talked because the steps were the only way down and he wasn't in a hurry. The entire northern corridor, Hayes was saying, from Ridgeline Creek all the way to the granite shelf. I want it surveyed and documented before the federal assessor arrives. The man in the city coat said something quiet that Caleb couldn't catch. Hayes said, "The existing claimants are not your concern. I'll handle the existing claimants." Dodd caught Caleb watching and gave him a look that was meant to be intimidating. Caleb held it for exactly 1 second, then looked away because he wasn't interested in a contest, and he had coffee to drink. He went to the bench outside the feed store and sat down and rolled a cigarette and tried to pay attention to the mountains instead of the conversation. He almost managed it. "You're Caleb Morgan." He looked up. The woman standing in front of him was carrying a basket covered with a cloth and wearing an expression that suggested she had made a decision about something and wasn't second-guessing it. She was perhaps 27, with dark hair pinned up under a practical hat, and eyes that were doing the kind of work most people didn't bother doing, actually looking at him. "I reckon," he said. "You worked the northern fence line for the Hargrove spread." "I did. For 11 days. Thereabouts." She shifted the basket from one arm to the other. "Mr. Hargrove says you found 3 separate cuts and repaired all of them and didn't charge him for the extra days." Caleb thought about that for a moment. "I quoted him a job. The job was bigger than I thought. That's not his fault. He thinks you're a fool for it. He's probably right. Something moved in her expression. Not amusement exactly, more like recognition. Like he had said something she hadn't expected, but had been hoping to hear. "I'm Clara Bennett," she said. "My father owns the 40-acre parcel at the base of Sentinel Ridge." Caleb knew the parcel. Not large, not particularly profitable. But the land was good, and the water rights were solid, and whoever had chosen it had known what they were doing. "Walter Bennett's daughter," he said. "Yes, your father's a careful man." "He is." She paused. "He's also sick. Has been for about 4 months now. His lungs." She said it plainly without dramatizing it the way people talked about hard things when they had been living with them long enough to stop flinching. "He can't manage the summer work himself. He's been trying to find someone reliable." Caleb looked at his coffee. "I'm not looking for hired work right now," he said. "I've got a commitment up at the Dawson place through the end of July." "I know. He knows. He wasn't asking you to start tomorrow." She held his gaze in a way that felt less like pressure and more like an honest transaction. "He was asking me to find out if you were the kind of man worth asking." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And what did you decide?" "I haven't yet," she said. "That's why I'm still talking to you." He almost smiled. He stopped himself, but it was a close thing. Chad. He finished his business in town and rode back toward the Dawson place with the conversation sitting in the back of his mind in a way he didn't entirely welcome. He had not talked to a woman who looked at him like that in 11 years. Not because women hadn't looked, but because he had learned with some precision how to be the kind of man people stopped seeing. Useful but invisible, present but forgettable. It was a skill like any other. Clara Bennett had looked at him like he wasn't forgettable. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He heard about the trouble at the Bennett place 2 weeks later from Hargrove's youngest hand, a boy named Eddie who had the useful quality of knowing everything that happened in a 20-mile radius before anyone else did. "They're saying Hayes wants the Sentinel Ridge parcel," Eddie said without preamble while they were restringing wire on the east pasture. "Told Walter Bennett he's got until the end of August to sell, or Hayes'll file a competing survey claim." Caleb pulled the wire taut and didn't answer. "Walter Bennett told him to go to the devil," Eddie continued. "Which, if you ask me, was the correct answer, but also maybe not the wisest one considering." "Considering what?" "Considering Hayes owns 3 members of the county commission and the banknote on half the properties in this valley." Caleb set the pliers down for a moment. "How bad is Bennett's note?" Eddie shrugged. "Bad enough. He borrowed against the place 2 years ago when the well needed drilling. Payments due in October." He paused. "Hayes bought the note last month, from what I hear." Caleb picked the pliers back up. He didn't say anything for the rest of the afternoon, but he thought. So, he went to see Walter Bennett on a Thursday at the end of his Dawson commitment before he'd even stopped to eat or change his coat. He told himself it was professional. He was between jobs. The man needed help. It was a simple calculation. He knew it wasn't entirely that. But he didn't examine the rest of it too closely. Walter Bennett was sitting on the porch when Caleb rode up wrapped in a blanket, despite the summer heat, which told Caleb more than any doctor's report would have. He was perhaps 60, with a face that had once been strong and was still trying to be, and eyes that were sharp in a way that sickness hadn't touched. He watched Caleb dismount without speaking. Caleb tied off his horse and walked to the foot of the porch steps and took off his hat. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I'm Caleb Morgan. I believe your daughter mentioned—" "I know who you are," Walter said. "Sit down." Caleb sat on the step. Walter looked at him for a long moment, with the particular thoroughness of a man who had learned to make assessments quickly because he didn't always have the luxury of time. "My daughter says you're honest," Walter said. "I try to be. She says you don't talk much." "No, sir." "She says when you do talk, it's worth listening to." Caleb looked at his hat. "I'm not sure she's had enough of a sample to determine that. She's a good judge." Walter coughed a deep rattling sound that he controlled quickly with the practice of someone who had been controlling it for months. "I need someone to manage the summer work. The cattle need moving to the high pasture before the heat breaks the grass down here. The north irrigation channel has a blockage I haven't been able to clear, and there are 3 sections of fence on the ridgeline that a man named Dodd cut last month. Caleb looked up at that. Dodd, Hayes's foreman. The same. Walter's voice was even. I have no proof of it that would hold in a court, but I know what I know. Yes, sir. If I hire you for this work, Walter said, you should understand something. Hayes will not make it comfortable for you. He's already driven off 2 men I tried to hire this summer. One of them he bought off. The other one... He paused. The other one had his horse injured in a way that was difficult to prove was deliberate. Caleb was quiet for a moment. What are you paying? He said. Walter named a number. It was fair. Not generous, but fair. And Caleb understood the difference between a man who was offering what he could and a man who was offering what he thought he could get away with. All right, Caleb said. Walter looked at him steadily. You're not going to ask me about Hayes, about what you'd be getting into. You already told me what I'd be getting into. Most men would want more information. Most men would use the information to negotiate a better price, Caleb said. I'm not that kind of man. Walter was quiet for a moment. And then he did something Caleb didn't expect. He smiled. Not the way people smiled when they were pleased with themselves, but the way they smiled when something confirmed a thing they had been hoping was true. No, he said. I don't reckon you are. Doe. The first week of work on the Bennett place was hard and hot, and exactly the kind of labor Caleb understood in his bones. He moved the cattle to the high pasture in 3 days, working from before first light until the heat made the animals too restless to manage, then resting through the worst of the afternoon and picking up again toward evening. He found the blockage in the north irrigation channel, a deliberate one, stones packed in with enough care that it didn't look accidental to anyone who knew what they were looking at, and cleared it in a day. The fence line was more complicated. The 3 sections Dodd had cut were on the ridge, which meant reaching them required a 2-hour ride up switchback trails that were barely wide enough for a horse. Caleb made the ride twice before he understood the pattern of the cuts, not random, but placed precisely to push the Bennett cattle toward Hayes's property line, where they would be legally indistinguishable from Hayes's own stock without a brand inspection. It was elegant in a vicious way. Caleb had to respect the thinking, even while he despised it. He repaired the sections and reinforced them with extra posts, which took 3 days and cost him a gash on his left palm from a wire end that caught him when his concentration slipped. He wrapped it with his bandana and kept working. He didn't mention any of this to Walter. The man had enough to carry. But he mentioned it to Clara. Dang. She brought lunch to the field on the 4th day, not because it was expected of her, he sensed, but because she had made a decision about something, and this was how she was acting on it. She set the basket down on a fence post and handed him a wrapped bundle without ceremony. He took it grateful, in a way he kept off his face. How's the ridgeline? She asked. Fixed. He unwrapped the bundle. Biscuits, cold beef, and apple. He hadn't eaten properly since Tuesday. Reinforced. It won't happen again easily. But it'll happen. Probably. He looked at her. Your father needs to document the cuts. Write down the dates, the locations, the pattern. If Hayes files a competing survey claim, that documentation will matter. Clara was quiet for a moment. You think it'll get that far? I think Hayes has a plan, Caleb said, and I think the banknote is part of it. She didn't flinch. We know about the banknote. What are you going to do about it? We're trying to find another lender. She said it steadily, but he heard the thing underneath the particular exhaustion of someone who had been trying for a while without success. It's difficult. Hayes has relationships with most of the financial institutions in this county. There are institutions outside this county. Yes, I've written 3 letters. 2 didn't respond. 1 responded to say they didn't lend on properties in disputed territory. Her voice stayed flat, but her jaw tightened slightly. The land isn't in disputed territory. Hayes just told them it was. Caleb ate his biscuit and thought about that. My father won't sell, she said. I want you to understand that. Whatever Hayes does, he built this place. His wife is buried on the north side of the ridge. She paused. He'll lose the land before he sells it to the man who's been trying to steal it. That's a fine principle, Caleb said carefully. But losing the land and keeping the principle still means losing the land. She looked at him sharply. He held her gaze. I'm not telling you to sell. I'm telling you that principle alone won't stop a bank foreclosure. The silence stretched between them for a moment. Then something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but opening like a door moved off a stuck latch. What would stop it? She said. Evidence, documentation, and someone willing to take it to a federal land office, not the county one. He paused. Hayes owns the county. He doesn't own the federal assessor. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with that particular quality of attention he had noticed the first time they spoke, the kind that didn't slide off to the side or look for an easier thing to land on. You've thought about this, she said. I think about most things. You don't seem like a man who talks much about what he thinks. I'm not. He handed her back the empty cloth. But you asked a direct question. I'll try to remember that, she said. It might have been dry. It might have been something else. He wasn't sure. She picked up the basket and walked back toward the house, and he watched her go for exactly 1 second before he turned back to the fence line. The trouble came on a Friday afternoon when the heat was at its worst, and Caleb was working alone near the south gate. He heard the horses before he saw them. 2 riders coming down the ridge trail at a pace that was deliberately unhurried, the way men moved when they wanted you to understand they weren't in a rush because you were not a concern. Dodd was in front. The other man Caleb didn't know, heavy-set with a flat expression and the particular posture of someone hired specifically for his physicality. They pulled up 10 feet from where Caleb was working and didn't dismount. Morgan, Dodd said. Caleb set down his wire stretcher and straightened. He didn't reach for anything. He just stood. Dodd, he said. Mr. Hayes wanted me to pass along a message. All right. He said a man in your position, no land, no ties, no particular future in this valley, might want to think carefully about which disputes he gets himself involved in. Dodd's voice was pleasant. That was the most dangerous kind. It'd be a shame for a working man to find himself without work, in a county where Mr. Hayes has a lot of friends. Caleb looked at him steadily. Tell Mr. Hayes I appreciate his concern. Dodd smiled. Is that the message? That's the message. The smile stayed. You know I've run off better men than you from better situations than this. I don't doubt it, Caleb said. Is there anything else? Dodd looked at him for a long moment. Caleb didn't shift his weight, didn't cross his arms, didn't look away. He had been looked at by harder men than Dodd in harder situations than a fence line in August, and he had learned that stillness was its own kind of answer. Finally, Dodd turned his horse, and the 2 of them rode back the way they had come. Caleb watched them go. Then he picked up his wire stretcher and went back to work. He didn't tell Walter about Dodd's visit. But that evening, when he came back to the barn to settle his horse, Clara was waiting in the yard with a lantern and an expression that said she already knew. Eddie Hargrove saw them on the Ridge Road, she said. Eddie Hargrove sees everything. Are you going to leave? He considered the question seriously because she had asked it seriously. No. Why not? He thought about that. The honest answer was complicated something about the north fence line and the documents he'd been building in his head, and the particular stubbornness that had kept him alive through 11 years of moving from one high country job to the next. Something about the fact that the wrong people winning had always bothered him more than it was strictly useful. Something if he was being fully honest with himself about the way Clara Bennett had handed him lunch without ceremony and asked direct questions and not looked away. But he didn't say most of that. He said, because the work isn't finished. She looked at him for a long moment in the lantern light, and then she nodded once with the particular decisiveness of a woman who had made a judgment and wasn't going to revisit it. All right, she said. Then I'll show you what I've found.
Want a tour?
What she'd found was in a box under her father's desk. Letters, survey notes, copies of land filings receipts. She had been collecting them for 3 months quietly, without telling her father how far along she was, because she didn't want to give him hope she couldn't back up. Caleb sat at the kitchen table and went through them while she sat across from him with her hands folded and watched him read. The pattern was clear to him within 20 minutes. Hayes had been filing false boundary claims with the county land office since 1883, not dramatically but incrementally shaving acreage here and there, adjusting survey markers, submitting amended filings that contradicted original ones, and depended on the county recorder not comparing them carefully. The county recorder Caleb had noted was a man named Purcell, who attended church with Hayes and whose wife had been given a position at Hayes's trading company the previous spring. "This isn't just about your father's land," Caleb said. "No." Clara's voice was steady. "I counted at least 6 other properties." "Have you talked to the other owners?" "I've talked to 3 of them. 2 of them don't want to get involved. One of them, Tom Aldridge, down near the creek fork, he's been keeping his own records. He'd be willing to go to a federal office if someone else was willing to go with him." Caleb looked at the documents. He looked at the careful, precise handwriting in the margins. Clara's he understood organizing and cross-referencing over months of quiet, methodical work. He looked at her. "You've been doing this alone," he said. "My father doesn't need more to worry about. And you didn't tell anyone because in this county," she said evenly, "telling the wrong person is the same as telling Hayes." He nodded slowly. "The federal land office is in Cheyenne." "I know." "Someone would need to make the trip. Present the documentation in person. A written submission can be delayed or lost." He paused. "Or intercepted." She held his gaze. "I know that too. It would take at least a week, maybe more. And if Hayes finds out before the submission is filed, I know what it would mean." Her voice didn't waver. "I've known what it would mean for 3 months. What I didn't have was someone I trusted to go." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the summer night pressing against the windows, crickets, a distant coyote, the low breathing of the house around them. Caleb looked at his hands. The gash on his left palm had started to close. He'd need to keep it clean for another few days. "I'll go," he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "You don't owe us anything," she said, and it wasn't false modesty or a test. He could hear the honesty in it. She was telling him the truth in case he'd forgotten it. "You've already done the work you contracted for." "I know that." "Hayes will make trouble for you, regardless of what happens in Cheyenne. Probably." "So why, Miss Bennett?" He said it quietly. "I told you, the work isn't finished." She looked at him. The lantern between them made the shadows move slightly, and in that light her expression had something in it he didn't have a precise word for, not gratitude exactly, and not relief, though it was close to both. Something rawer than either of those. Something that looked like what people looked like when they had been carrying something too heavy for too long and someone had finally, without being asked, put a hand under the weight. He looked away before either of them had to decide what to do about it. "I'll need copies of everything," he said. "Properly organized, and I'll need Tom Aldridge's records as well if he's willing. I can have them ready by Monday." "Monday's good." He stood and pushed back from the table and picked up his hat. At the door he paused. "Your father," he said. "He should know what you've done, what you've been doing." He didn't turn around. "A man ought to know when his family is fighting for him." He heard her breath shift slightly behind him, just the smallest catch. "I'll tell him," she said. He nodded once and went out into the summer dark. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew what he was going to find in Cheyenne, and he already knew with the particular clarity of a man who had been trying not to know something for several weeks what he was going to find when he came back. But that was a problem for later. Right now, the work wasn't finished, and Caleb Morgan always finished his work. Caleb left before sunrise on Monday. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't ask anyone to see him off. He tied his saddlebags, checked the documents Clara had organized into a leather satchel, and rode out of Silver Creek while the town was still sleeping, and the air still carried the thin coolness that burned off by 8 o'clock every morning in August. The documents were wrapped in oilcloth. Clara had thought of that herself. 3 months of careful solitary work, and she had thought to waterproof them without being told. He rode with the satchel against his body. He wasn't taking chances. The road to Cheyenne was 2 days in good conditions. Caleb pushed for 1.5, stopping only when his horse needed water and resting for 4 hours in the dark before pressing on again. He didn't sleep well in unfamiliar places on important errands. He never had. It was one of the ways his body had adapted to 11 years of working alone, a constant low-level alertness that didn't fully release until a job was finished. He reached the federal land office on Tuesday afternoon. The clerk at the desk was a young man with the distracted look of someone who processed paper all day and had learned to treat urgency as someone else's problem. "I need to file a formal complaint regarding fraudulent boundary claims in Cutler County," Caleb said. "I have documentation." The clerk looked at him over his spectacles. "You'll need to fill out a Form 14B and submit it with—" "I've already prepared the submission," Caleb said. He set the satchel on the counter and opened it, and laid out the documents in the order Clara had organized them. Survey discrepancies dating to 1883. At least 7 affected properties. I have original filings, amended filings, and a side-by-side comparison showing the alterations. He paused. I also have a signed affidavit from a second property owner corroborating the pattern. Tom Aldridge had signed it Sunday evening at his kitchen table with the particular quiet courage of a man who had been waiting for someone else to move first. The clerk looked at the documents. Something shifted in his expression, the professional detachment giving way just slightly to actual attention. "You said Cutler County," the clerk said. "Yes. Richard Hayes's territory." Caleb looked at him steadily. "Is that a problem?" The clerk was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the first document and began to read it with considerably more focus than he had given anything else that afternoon. "Wait here," he said. He was in Cheyenne for 3 days. The federal assessor, a compact, careful man named Birch, who had the precise manner of someone who had seen enough falsified paperwork to be permanently skeptical of everything read through the entire submission twice. He asked Caleb questions. He asked them again in different orders the way experienced men tested consistency. He sent a wire to the county land office in Silver Creek, requesting the original filings, which Caleb noted he did, without explaining why, which meant he didn't want the county recorder to have time to prepare. On the 3rd morning, Birch called Caleb back into his office. "This is substantial," Birch said. He didn't say it warmly. He said it like a man confirming the weight of something he had just picked up. "If the pattern holds when we compare against the county records, and I have no reason to believe it won't, we're looking at systematic fraud going back at least 3 years. Yes, sir. I want to be clear about what happens next." Birch leaned forward. "I'll send an investigator to Cutler County. That process takes time. It is not swift. In the meantime, the county commission retains its authority over local land disputes. Hayes owns the county commission. I'm aware of the implications." Birch's voice didn't change. "What I can do immediately is issue a federal hold on any contested boundary changes in the affected corridor. That stops the clock on any forced survey proceedings or foreclosure actions tied to disputed acreage." Caleb straightened. "How long does the hold last?" "Until the federal investigation concludes. Minimum 90 days. Likely longer. 90 days. Walter Bennett's banknote was due in October. That was 60 days, not 90. But a federal hold on the land itself changed the equation. No bank would move on a foreclosure while a federal investigation was active on the same property. The legal exposure was too large. "Can you put that in writing?" Caleb said. Birch looked at him for a moment. "You're not a lawyer." "No, sir. But I know how to read." Birch almost smiled. He picked up his pen. Caleb rode back into Silver Creek on Thursday evening, with the federal hold order folded in his breast pocket, and the particular feeling in his chest of a man who has done the right thing and doesn't yet know what it's going to cost him. He found out the next morning. He came to the Bennett place at first light before the heat had settled, and Clara was already in the yard. She saw him before he was halfway up the lane, and the way her shoulders dropped just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, told him she had been more worried than she had let herself show. He dismounted and handed her the federal hold order without preamble. She read it. He watched her face as she read it, the careful, controlled focus giving way to something that moved through her expression like weather. She read it again. "A federal investigation," she said. "Active as of Tuesday. The hold on contested boundary changes is immediate." She looked up at him. "The banknote. A bank won't foreclose on land under federal investigation. The liability is too high. It doesn't solve the note you still owe the money, but it buys time. Time to find another lender without Hayes's interference. Time to let the investigation do its work." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She folded the document with the same careful precision she put into everything and held it against her chest with both hands. "You did this," she said. "Your documentation did it," Caleb said. "I just carried it to the right desk." "Don't do that." He looked at her. "Don't make it smaller than it is," she said. Her voice was even, but underneath it was something with edges. "I've had enough of people making things smaller than they are. What you did matters. Say it matters." He was quiet for a moment. He wasn't used to that kind of directness. He wasn't used to someone insisting he be acknowledged. "It matters," he said. "I'm glad I could do it." She nodded once as if that was sufficient, as if she had simply needed him to confirm it, and now they could both move on. She turned toward the house. "My father wants to see you." Walter Bennett was sitting up in his bed, which was an improvement from the previous week, when he'd been unable to sit up without coughing. He had the document in his hands when Caleb came in. Clara must have gone ahead, and he read it twice before he looked up. "Birch," Walter said. "You got to Birch directly." He was the senior assessor on duty. He's the best one they have. Straightest man in the federal land office. Walter set the document down on the blanket. Most men who went to Cheyenne with this kind of submission would have talked to whoever was at the desk, would have filled out their Form 14B and waited. He looked at Caleb. "How did you know to ask for Birch?" "I didn't," Caleb said. "The clerk went to get him. I think the documentation was thorough enough that he knew it needed someone senior." Walter was quiet. "That's my daughter's work." "It is." "She didn't tell me she'd been doing it. 3 months. His voice had a quality Caleb recognized, the complicated pride of a parent who was also chastened. "She was protecting me." "Yes, sir." "She's been protecting me for 4 months, Walter said. "Running the place, managing the books, dealing with Hayes's foreman, when he comes around writing letters to lenders who don't write back." He coughed, controlled, brief. "And I've been lying in this bed feeling sorry for myself." Caleb didn't offer reassurance. He understood that sometimes the right response to a man's honest self-assessment was silence. "You're a good man, Morgan," Walter said. It wasn't flattery, it was a conclusion. "I want you to know I see that." Caleb shifted his hat in his hands. "I appreciate it, sir." "My daughter sees it too." Walter held his gaze. "I mention that not to make you uncomfortable, but because I think you're the kind of man who talks himself out of things he deserves." Caleb had no answer for that. He looked at his hat. Walter let him have the silence. Then he said, "Stay on through the summer. The wages stand. There's more to do." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "I know." What happened next came from a direction Caleb hadn't accounted for, which was unusual. He was generally good at accounting for directions. It was Clara who told him 2 days after his return, while they were working in the north field, she on one side of a fence, repair him on the other, the way they had fallen into working together without either of them planning it. "Hayes came to see my father yesterday," she said. Caleb set down his hammer. "While I was in town, While you were in town. Her voice was level. He came alone, which was unusual. No Dodd, no hired man. He sat in the parlor for 20 minutes and talked about the federal investigation like it was a minor inconvenience. Then he offered to buy the place outright. Cash settlement above market value immediate. And your father said, my father told him the land wasn't for sale. Caleb picked up his hammer. Then Hayes left. Not immediately. She paused, and the pause had weight. He said something on his way out. He said, she stopped, started again. He said he admired my father's loyalty to a man who wouldn't be around long enough to matter. The hammer came down harder than he intended on the fence post. He turned to look at her. He was talking about me. Yes? Clara held his gaze. He said your name, Caleb. He said that men without roots tend to move on when things get difficult, and that my father shouldn't make permanent decisions based on temporary loyalties. Caleb was quiet. He was trying to rattle my father, he said finally. He succeeded. Her voice was careful but honest. Not about selling. My father won't sell. But he was rattled. He asked me this morning whether I knew how long you were planning to stay. Caleb looked at the fence post. Then he looked at Clara. She was watching him with the same quality of attention she always had. Not demanding, not pressuring, just fully present and completely honest. What did you tell him? Caleb said. I told him I didn't know. She paused. Because I don't. The summer air sat between them thick and warm. A hawk circled somewhere above the ridge, riding a thermal lazily patient. I haven't decided to leave, Caleb said. That's different from deciding to stay. He looked at her directly. I know that. She nodded slowly. She picked up her end of the wire. He picked up his. They kept working. But the conversation didn't leave him. It settled into the back of his mind and stayed there the way important things did, not loud, but permanent. The next blow came from the bank. Not from Hayes directly. That wasn't how he operated. Caleb was beginning to understand. Hayes didn't move in straight lines. He moved in angles, applying pressure at points that were difficult to trace back to him. The bank sent a letter. A routine communication, it said, regarding the terms of the Bennett property loan. Due to concerns about the property's involvement in an ongoing federal investigation, the bank was exercising its right to request an accelerated review of the loan's collateral status. Caleb read the letter at the kitchen table, standing up, while Clara stood across from him with her arms folded, and Walter sat nearby with the particular stillness of a man managing his reaction. Accelerated review, Caleb said. That's not a foreclosure. Not yet, Clara said. It's designed to look like a precursor to one, to frighten you into a decision before the federal investigation completes. He set the letter down. The investigation holds protect the land from contested boundary changes. They don't directly protect a private loan instrument. So Hayes found the gap, Walter said. He found the gap. Caleb was quiet for a moment, turning it over. Who is the bank? Territorial Savings, Clara said. In Laramie. Not in Silver Creek. No, my father didn't trust the local bank. 2 years ago, the local bank was already in Hayes's pocket, Caleb finished. Yes, he straightened up. Then there are people at Territorial Savings who are not in Hayes's pocket. There has to be, or Hayes wouldn't need to work this indirectly. He'd just call in the note outright. He picked up the letter again. He's leaning on someone in their loan department, but the bank's leadership may not know what's being done in their name. Clara looked at him. You think we should go to Laramie? I think someone should go to Laramie, he said. With the federal hold documentation and the full submission history and a very clear explanation of how this loan request fits into a pattern of coordinated pressure from an individual currently under federal investigation for land fraud. Walter and Clara looked at each other. I can't make the trip, Walter said. The fact was plain, and he stated it plainly. I'll go, Clara said. You shouldn't go alone, Caleb said. Then come with me. The simplicity of it landed between them. Not an invitation with layers. Not a question with subtext. Just a direct statement from a woman who had learned that the most efficient thing was almost always the most honest thing. "All right," Caleb said. They left for Laramie the following morning. Dodd saw them ride out. Caleb knew because he saw Dodd see them. The foreman was on the ridge road watching the Bennett place with the patience of a man who had been stationed there deliberately, and his eyes tracked them as they rode onto the main road and turned south. "He'll report to Hayes within the hour," Caleb said. "I know." Clara rode easily with the competence of someone raised to it. "Does that change anything?" "No, but it means Hayes will know before we get to Laramie, which means he'll try to get there first." He paused. "Do you know anyone at Territorial Savings? Anyone at all?" "My father did business with a man named Alcott there, before he got sick. He said he was honest." "Alcott's still there?" "I don't know." "Then Alcott is who we ask for," Caleb said. "If he's there, we're in better shape than we think. If he's not, we go to whoever is above the loan department, and we tell the story from the beginning." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're very calm about all of this." "I'm not particularly calm," he said. "I just think better when I keep my voice level." She glanced at him. "Is that something you learned?" "The hard way," he said. "Most things I know I learned the hard way." She looked back at the road ahead. "What was the hardest?" He didn't answer immediately. The road stretched out before them straight and dry, the summer heat already building at mid-morning. "Figuring out that surviving something isn't the same as being finished with it," he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "How long did that take you?" 11 years, he said. "I'm not entirely sure I'm done." She didn't push further. He was grateful for that. She had the rare quality of knowing when she had enough of an answer. Chad, Alcott was there. He was older than Caleb expected, late 50s, with the careful, measured manner of a man who had spent his career handling other people's difficult situations and had developed genuine compassion for the difficulty without losing the precision required to solve it. He looked at the documentation for a long time. He read the federal hold order. He read the submission summary Caleb had brought back from Cheyenne. He read the bank letter and then read it again. Then he looked at Clara. "Miss Bennett, your father, how is he?" "Sick," she said. "But fighting." Alcott nodded slowly. He folded the bank letter and set it to the side. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "The letter you received was not generated by this office's leadership. I've been here 23 years. I would have known about a review request on a performing loan in a federally protected property status." He paused. "Someone in our loan department acted outside their authority." Caleb watched Clara absorb that. She kept her expression steady, but her hands folded on the table, pressed together slightly. "What happens now?" she said. "I'll need to conduct an internal review," Alcott said. "That will take several days. In the meantime..." He opened his desk drawer and took out a piece of bank letterhead. "I'm going to draft a notice confirming that the Bennett loan is in good standing and is not subject to any accelerated review proceedings. That notice will go to your father, to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, and to our bank's board of directors." "Hayes will know," Caleb said. "Yes," Alcott said. "He will." He looked at Caleb directly. "Are you prepared for what that means?" "Tell me what you think it means," Caleb said. Alcott set down his pen. "Richard Hayes is a man who has operated in this territory for a long time with very little resistance. The federal investigation changes that, but investigations take time. In the meantime, a man like Hayes, a man who is used to controlling outcomes, becomes unpredictable when he understands he's losing control." He paused. "I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it because you should know the difference between winning the legal battle and being safe." Caleb nodded. He had already known that, but hearing it stated plainly by a man with no stake in it confirmed something. "We understand," Clara said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. Caleb looked at her and thought about what Walter had said, that she had been carrying this for 4 months alone, protecting her father from the weight of it. He understood now with more precision than he had before what that had actually cost her.
You do.
They started back toward Silver Creek late that afternoon and made it halfway before the light failed, and the sensible thing was to stop at a way station for the night. The way station had a single public room and 2 private ones. Caleb paid for both without discussion. He was not the kind of man who created situations that put a woman in a difficult position, and Clara was not the kind of woman who would have allowed it anyway. They ate at the public table with 3 other travelers, a cattle buyer from Denver, a minister headed for a parish in Rock Springs, and a woman about Clara's age who was visiting family, and talked enough for all of them. Caleb was glad of the noise. It meant he didn't have to fill the silence. After dinner, Clara sat near the window while the other travelers drifted off to their rooms, and Caleb sat across from her with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "Alcott will do what he said," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I think so," Caleb said. "He's been there 23 years. He's not going to protect whoever in his department did Hayes a favor. It costs him too much. So the bank threat goes away." "The bank threat goes away." She was quiet. Outside, the summer night was full of sound insects, a horse somewhere, the distant low of cattle. "That leaves the investigation," she said. "And Hayes." "Yes." Birch said minimum 90 days, likely longer. "Yes." "So Hayes has 90 days to make our lives difficult." "He has 90 days to make your lives difficult," Caleb said. "He has less incentive to come after me. I don't have anything he wants." Clara looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, quick and then controlled. "You're wrong about that," she said quietly. He looked at her. "He wants you gone," she said. "You're the reason the federal investigation exists. You're the reason the bank letter didn't work. You're the reason—" She stopped, started again. "He doesn't want you gone because you're a threat to his land scheme. He wants you gone because you keep standing between him and outcomes he expects to control." Caleb held her gaze. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know I'm not." She held his gaze without flinching. "Which means we have a problem." "We?" he said. He said it quietly, not pointedly, just noting it. She didn't look away. "Yes, we." The word sat between them with a particular weight that neither of them addressed directly. Caleb looked at his coffee. Clara looked at her hands. The cattle buyer from Denver snored softly in the corner. "Go to sleep, Miss Bennett," Caleb said finally. "Tomorrow's a long ride." "It's Clara," she said. She stood up from the table. She didn't make a production of it. "You've ridden to Cheyenne for my family, and sat in a bank office in Laramie for my family, and taken messages from Dodd's hired muscle on our fence line. I think that earns a first name." He looked up at her. "Good night, Clara," he said. She nodded once, went to her room without looking back. He sat with his cold coffee for another 10 minutes, listening to the summer night, and the snoring cattle buyer, and the particular quiet of a man who is starting to understand that the careful, invisible life he has been living for 11 years is no longer quite as available to him as it used to be. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. That was a lie. He knew exactly how he felt about it. He just hadn't decided yet what to do with that knowledge. They rode back into Silver Creek the following afternoon to find Eddie Hargrove waiting at the end of the Bennett Lane with the particular expression of a young man who is carrying bad news and is not sure how to start. "What happened?" Caleb said. Not a question. "Dodd came to the place yesterday afternoon," Eddie said, "with 4 men. I don't know all their names. Mr. Bennett was alone." Clara went still on her horse. "Is my father—" "He's all right," Eddie said quickly. "He's all right, Miss Clara. They didn't touch him, but they—" He looked at Caleb. "They went through the house, said they were looking for stolen survey documents that were the property of the Hayes Land Company." Caleb kept his voice level. "Did they take anything?" "No, because—" Eddie's expression shifted to something that was almost pride. "Because your father had already moved everything. He'd put it all in the well house under the feed sacks when he saw them coming up the lane." Eddie paused. "He said to tell you he's not as slow as he looks." Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry. She dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and walked toward the house at a pace that was just below a run. Caleb dismounted more slowly. He stood with his horse's reins in his hand and looked at the house and thought about Walter Bennett sick and alone watching 4 of Hayes's men ride up his lane and quietly, deliberately moving the documents that could save his land before they arrived. "Eddie," he said. "Yeah." "Tell me who the 4 men were, everyone you recognized." Eddie told him. Caleb listened. He didn't reach for anything. He just stood very still the way he had stood on the fence line when Dodd had come to threaten him, and let the information settle into the place in his mind where he kept things that mattered. "All right," he said. "Thank you." He tied his horse to the post and walked into the house to find Walter Bennett sitting in his chair with his spine straight and his chin level, holding a cup of tea Clara had just put in his hands. Walter looked at him when he walked in. "They didn't find anything," Walter said. "I know. I want you to understand something." Walter set the cup down. His hands were steady. "I am not a well man. I am aware of that. I cannot always do what needs to be done." He paused. "But I am not finished. Not yet. And I will not let Richard Hayes decide when I'm finished." "No, sir," Caleb said. "I don't believe you will." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, who was standing near the window with her arms crossed and a look on her face that Caleb had not seen before, something furious and frightened and fiercely quietly proud. Then Walter looked back at Caleb. "He came here," Walter said, "because he wants you to know he can." "I know. What are you going to do about it?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands once. Then he set it on the table. "I'm going to finish the work," he said. The summer pressed against the windows. The afternoon light held. And somewhere on the ridge above Silver Creek, Caleb Morgan was fairly certain Dodd was watching. Let him watch. The letter from Birch arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after they returned from Laramie. Caleb was at the north fence when Eddie rode up with it, holding it out like it was something that might bite. Caleb wiped his hands on his trousers and took it and read it standing up the way he read everything that mattered. Birch's language was measured precise, the language of a federal official who chose every word like he was building something load-bearing. But the meaning was plain enough. The investigation had uncovered 3 additional fraudulent survey filings beyond what Clara's documentation had identified. The federal hold was being extended. And this was the part that made Caleb read the sentence twice. A formal subpoena had been issued for Richard Hayes to appear before a federal land tribunal in Cheyenne within 30 days. 30 days. Caleb folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket and stood there for a moment with his hand flat against his chest, feeling the paper under his shirt. 30 days was not very long, but it was long enough for a man who understood he was losing to do considerable damage on his way down. He rode to the house faster than he normally rode anywhere. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table with her father beside her, and when she finished, she set it down and looked at Caleb with an expression that was equal parts relief and something much more careful. "He'll know about this already," she said. "Before we do, probably. He has people at the federal office." "So he has 30 days. "Yes." Walter picked up the letter and read it himself slowly with the thoroughness of a man who had learned not to trust summaries. When he finished, he set it down with the particular care of someone handling something fragile. 30 days, Walter said. "In my experience, cornered men fall into 2 categories." He looked at Caleb. "Those who give up and those who burn everything down on their way out. Which kind is Hayes?" Walter didn't hesitate. "The second kind." Caleb nodded. He had already known that. He had just needed to hear it confirmed by a man who had known Hayes for 20 years. "Then we need to be ready," Caleb said. "Ready for what specifically?" Clara said. "Not challenging. Practical." She needed a specific answer so she could take specific action, and that was exactly the kind of woman she was. "I don't know yet," Caleb said. "That's what worries me." He found out 9 days later. Not from Hayes directly. Not from Dodd. From the most unexpected source in Silver Creek, a woman named Margaret Purcell, the county recorder's wife, who appeared at the Bennett gate on a Wednesday morning while Caleb was repairing the south pasture post, and asked to speak with someone who could listen without talking to her husband about it afterward. Clara brought her inside. Caleb came in from the field because Clara sent Eddie to get him, and Eddie's face said it was the kind of thing that warranted interrupting work. Margaret Purcell was a small woman in her late 40s who sat with her hands in her lap and her back very straight, and spoke with the controlled precision of someone who had been rehearsing what she was about to say for a considerable amount of time and was determined to get through it without losing her nerve. "My husband is a weak man," she said without preamble. "I've known that for 15 years. Weak men look for strong ones to attach themselves to, and he attached himself to Richard Hayes because Hayes made him feel important and useful." She paused. "I didn't interfere because I told myself it wasn't my business. I'm here today because it has become my business." Caleb sat across from her and didn't say anything. Clara sat beside her and also didn't say anything. Caleb had noticed that Clara understood the same way he did that sometimes the most useful thing you could do for someone with a difficult truth was simply not interrupt it. "Hayes met with my husband 3 nights ago," Margaret said. "I wasn't supposed to hear. I heard." She looked at her hands. "He's planning to file a formal accusation of evidence tampering against the federal submission. He intends to claim that the documents submitted to the Cheyenne office were altered or fabricated. He has someone whose name I didn't recognize, who will sign an affidavit to that effect." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's perjury," Clara said. "Yes," Margaret said. "It won't stop the investigation permanently, but it will create enough legal confusion to delay the tribunal. And if Hayes can delay long enough—" She stopped. "Long enough for what?" Caleb said. Margaret looked at him directly. "He has another plan, for the Bennett land specifically." She folded her hands tighter. "He's going to file a physical obstruction claim. He's going to say that the north fence line, the one you repaired, was built on his property. He has a surveyor, a private one who will certify whatever measurements Hayes pays him to certify." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "A physical obstruction claim," he said, "filed with the county recorder's office." "Yes, your husband's office." Margaret looked at him with an expression that had self-condemnation in it and something harder than self-condemnation underneath it. "Yes, and your husband will process it. He was going to." She lifted her chin slightly. "I am here because I have decided that there are things I will not live with. My husband enabling perjury and property theft is one of them. Whether he agrees with me about that is—" Her voice stayed even. "His problem to work through after the fact." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what it had taken for her to come here. What it would cost her when Hayes found out, and Hayes would find out, because Hayes always found out. "Mrs. Purcell," he said, "will you put what you heard in writing, a signed statement witnessed by 2 people describing the conversation?" She had clearly anticipated this. She didn't hesitate. "Yes. And will you allow us to transmit that statement to the federal land office in Cheyenne, with a copy to the county sheriff's office in Laramie, before your husband has an opportunity to file the obstruction claim?" "That is exactly why I came today instead of tomorrow," she said. Caleb looked at Clara. Clara was already at the desk, pulling out paper. The statement took 2 hours to write, revise, and finalize, with Margaret Purcell dictating and Clara writing, and Caleb listening for anything that needed to be more specific or less open to interpretation. When it was done, Margaret signed it. Clara signed as witness. Caleb signed as witness. Walter Bennett, who had come downstairs at some point during the 2nd hour and seated himself quietly in the corner without anyone asking him to leave, signed as a second witness without being asked. Margaret Purcell looked at Walter's signature for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have come sooner." "You came," Walter said. "That's what matters now." She nodded once, smoothed her skirt with the particular composure of a woman who had made an irrevocable decision, and was going to carry it without flinching, and walked out to her horse. Caleb watched her ride away with a feeling that he identified after a moment as respect, the uncomplicated bedrock kind. Then he turned to Clara. "I need to ride to Laramie, tonight." "Tonight," she said. "If Hayes moves on the obstruction claim tomorrow, we need that statement already in the right hands." She didn't argue. She didn't tell him to rest or wait for morning. She looked at him with those direct, serious eyes and said, "Take the bay mare. She's faster than your horse." "I know where her tack is," he said. "I know you do." She held his gaze for one moment. "Come back." He put on his hat. "I always finish the work," he said. He rode out while the sun was still above the ridge. He made Laramie by midnight, which was not a comfortable ride, but was a necessary one. The sheriff's deputy who took the statement at the night desk was a young man who initially seemed inclined to make Caleb wait until morning and a senior officer was available. Caleb explained with some precision that the document he was delivering related to an active federal land fraud investigation involving a 30-day subpoena and a planned perjury filing, and that morning might be convenient for the deputy, but was going to be considerably less convenient for the integrity of the legal process. The deputy went and got the sheriff. The sheriff read the statement carefully. He was a thick-built man named Garrity, who had the unhurried manner of someone who had dealt with enough false urgency that he had learned to take his time, even when things actually were urgent. He read it twice. "Margaret Purcell," he said. "Yes, sir." "Her husband is the county recorder in Silver Creek." "Yes, sir." Garrity set the statement down. "You understand that filing a fraudulent affidavit with the Federal Land Office is a federal offense?" "I do." "And filing a falsified survey claim with the county recorder using a paid surveyor. Fraud, multiple counts." Garrity looked at him. "You're not a lawyer." "No. I'm a working man who has spent the last month watching someone try to steal a sick man's land, and I would like it to stop." Something shifted in Garrity's expression. The professional caution didn't leave, but something behind it acknowledged that the man sitting across from him was not making this up. "I'll wire Cheyenne first thing in the morning," Garrity said. "Wire them tonight," Caleb said. Garrity looked at him for a long moment. He got up and sent the wire himself. Caleb started back before dawn and rode hard enough that he was back at the Bennett place by early afternoon. He was tired in the deep muscle way that didn't respond to coffee, and his back hurt from the saddle, and the gash on his palm had reopened somewhere near the second hour of the return ride. He didn't mention any of that. Clara was in the yard when he rode up the same way she had been in the yard when he came back from Cheyenne. He was beginning to understand that this was not coincidence. She was watching for him. She had been watching for him. He dismounted. She came to take the mare's reins without being asked. "The statement is with the sheriff in Laramie," he said. "Garrity, he wired Cheyenne last night." "Last night?" She looked at him. "You rode straight through." The timing mattered. She looked at his hand. At the blood on the bandana he'd rewrapped around his palm somewhere east of Laramie. "Come inside," she said. "The horse needs—" "Eddie will take the horse." She said it with a finality that was not unkind. "Come inside." Nid. She cleaned the gash at the kitchen table with the efficient, unsentimental thoroughness of someone who had grown up on a working ranch and knew what wounds looked like and what they needed. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't tell him he should have been more careful. She just cleaned it, assessed it, and wrapped it properly. Her hands were steady. She worked close to him, close enough that he could have said something or moved, and chose to do neither. "Dodd was here this morning," she said while she worked. "With 2 men. They didn't come to the house. They stopped at the gate and looked at the property for about 20 minutes and then left." "Measuring," Caleb said. "That's what I thought. If Hayes's surveyor has already been here." "He hasn't," Clara said. "Not officially, but Dodd has eyes and a reasonable ability to estimate distances." She tied off the bandage with a neat, firm knot. "Which means Hayes is preparing to move on the obstruction claim soon. Possibly today." Caleb thought about that. Garrity's wire will have reached Cheyenne by now, he said. Birch will have it. Any fraudulent filing Hayes makes at the county level will be flagged immediately at the federal level. That doesn't stop Hayes from filing.
No, but it means the filing goes nowhere, and Hayes knows it goes nowhere. He looked at his bandaged hand. He might file anyway, to create confusion, to make your father spend money on legal defense he doesn't have. Clara was quiet. He wants to exhaust us, she said. Yes. She sat down across from him. She had been standing and working for the last 10 minutes, and the sitting was deliberate a decision to stop moving and say the thing she had been holding while her hands were busy.
Caleb, she said, how much longer can this go on? He looked at her. She wasn't asking out of weakness. She was asking because she needed an honest assessment, and she had learned over the last month that he would give her one. 21 days until the tribunal, he said. That's how much longer this has to go on. And in 21 days, Hayes appears before the federal tribunal and answers for 3 years of documented fraud. The investigation findings are entered into the federal record. The contested boundary claims are vacated. He paused. His ability to operate in this territory the way he has been operating ends. She held his gaze. You believe that? I do. Even knowing he'll fight every step of the way, especially knowing that, Caleb said, a man who fights this hard to avoid something is a man who understands what he's actually facing. Clara looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked back at him. What aren't you telling me? She said. He had underestimated her from the beginning, in this specific way, her ability to hear the thing underneath the thing. Hayes filed a personal complaint with the federal office yesterday, Caleb said. Not about the land, about me. Her expression didn't change, but her hands stilled. What kind of complaint? Claiming that I coerced Margaret Purcell into making a false statement, that I fabricated her account of the conversation. He said it evenly the way he said most difficult things. He's trying to discredit the statement before it can be used. By attacking you personally. By attacking me personally. Clara was very quiet for a moment. Outside, the summer afternoon pushed against the walls of the house, relentless and indifferent. What happens to you, she said carefully, if they take the complaint seriously? Birch won't take it seriously, Caleb said. He's a careful man. He'll look at the timeline the statement was filed before Hayes filed his complaint, which means I didn't fabricate it in response to anything Hayes did. He'll look at the other witnesses. He'll look at the full record. But it creates paperwork. And paperwork takes time. And Hayes understands that. He paused. It's not about whether I'm actually charged with anything. It's about creating enough noise that the main investigation gets cluttered. Clara stood up. She moved to the window. She stood with her back to him for a moment, and Caleb watched the set of her shoulders, the particular tension of someone who is deciding something and wants to make sure they've decided it correctly before they say it. She turned around. He's not coming after the land anymore, she said. Not primarily. He's coming after you. Caleb didn't deny it. If you leave, she said, the personal complaint goes away. The noise goes away. The investigation continues on the documentation alone without him being able to point at a person and say someone manipulated the process. Yes, Caleb said. Is that what you're thinking about doing? He looked at her directly. No. Why not? Because leaving doesn't actually stop him, Caleb said. It just stops him coming after me specifically. He'll find another angle on the investigation, another gap, another person to lean on. He paused. And because... He stopped. Because, she said. He held her gaze. Because I told you I'd finish the work, he said quietly. I meant it. The kitchen was very still. Clara looked at him for a long moment with an expression that he couldn't fully read and didn't try to not because he was incurious, but because some expressions deserved to be held by the person wearing them for as long as they needed to hold them. All right, she said finally. Then let's talk about what we do next. John, What they did next was Walter's idea, which surprised Caleb and clearly did not surprise Clara, which told him this was a pattern Walter thinking more strategically from his sickbed than most healthy men thought on their feet. "The other landowners," Walter said. "The ones Hayes has been filing false claims against. Not just Tom Aldridge, all of them." Caleb was listening. "Right now?" Walter said, "This looks like one family fighting a powerful man. One federal investigation with one primary complainant." He paused to manage a cough. "What it needs to look like is a community. 6 families, 7. All of them standing in the same direction." "Some of them don't want to get involved," Clara said. "Some of them didn't want to get involved last month," Walter said. "Last month, Hayes seemed untouchable. Today, he has a federal subpoena." He looked at Caleb. "People's willingness to get involved changes when they can see which way the wind is blowing." Caleb thought about that. "You want me to go to them. I want someone to go to them. I'd go myself, but—" Walter gestured at himself with a kind of dry precision. "Clara can't go alone, and you're the one who knows the legal situation well enough to explain it clearly. Some of them may still refuse." "Some of them will," Walter agreed. "But some won't. And the ones who won't need someone to come to them and tell them what they have is worth defending." He looked at Caleb steadily. "Can you do that?" Caleb thought about 5 families scattered across the valley and ridge country, each of them carrying 3 years of quiet, grinding pressure from a man who had made them feel small and isolated and alone with their problems. He thought about what it felt like to be the only person who believed something mattered. He thought about Clara working alone at a kitchen table for 3 months, cross-referencing documents no one had asked her to collect. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." Chatterpie. He spent the next 4 days riding. Not hard the way he'd ridden to Laramie, purposeful, steady, the kind of riding that covered ground without burning out the horse or the rider. He went to each of the affected properties in turn with the federal documentation and a clear, plain account of where the investigation stood and what the tribunal would mean. The first 2 families listened and said they'd think about it. He understood that. He'd given them a lot to consider, and they hadn't had time to sit with it. The third family, a couple named Briggs, who ran a small cattle operation on the eastern slope, said yes before he was halfway through the explanation. The wife had been keeping her own records different from Clara's but corroborating them, and she was visibly relieved to learn she was not alone in what she'd noticed. "I thought I was imagining it," Mrs. Briggs said. "I thought maybe I was too angry to see it right." "You weren't imagining it," Caleb said. "And you weren't too angry." She looked at him with an expression that reminded him with unexpected sharpness of the way Clara had looked when he'd told her the documents mattered. Like confirmation of something they had been afraid to believe. The 4th family refused. He accepted that. You couldn't force courage into people, and it wasn't useful to try. The 5th family, an older man named Horace Gentry, who had been in the valley longer than Hayes, and had a memory for details that was extraordinary, said yes, and then spent 2 hours giving Caleb additional information about early survey filings that added a dimension to the fraud pattern that Birch didn't have yet. Caleb wrote down everything Gentry said. All of it. He sent a wire to Cheyenne from the way station outside of town. Birch wired back within the day. 2 words. Keep going. He came back to the Bennett place on a Friday evening to find Clara in the yard, with a look that he recognized by now, the one that meant something had happened while he was away, and she had been managing it alone, and was relieved to not be alone with it anymore. "Hayes filed the obstruction claim," she said. He stopped. "When?" "This morning. Purcell processed it. His wife apparently tried to stop him and he filed it anyway." She paused. "She's left the house. She's staying with her sister in Rollins." Caleb absorbed that. Margaret Purcell, who had come here with a straight back and a prepared statement, was now in Rollins because her husband had chosen Hayes over her. "The federal hold should block the claim from proceeding," he said. "It does. Garrity sent notice to the county recorder's office within 2 hours of the filing." Clara's voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was the particular exhaustion of someone who had absorbed too many blows in too short a time. But Hayes's private surveyor is already making noise in town. He's been in the saloon telling anyone who'll listen that the federal investigation is based on fabricated documents and that the Bennetts will be off this land by winter. Let him talk. It's not about whether people believe him, Clara said. It's about what it feels like to have someone say it in public. It's about my father hearing it. She paused. He heard. Eddie told me. He doesn't say much about it, but I know him. Caleb looked at her. Where is he? Caleb said. On the porch. He walked past her toward the porch, and she didn't follow, which he understood was intentional. She understood there were conversations that went differently without an audience. Walter was sitting in his chair with his blanket and his cup, and his eyes were open and fixed on the ridgeline above the property with the particular quality of a man looking at something he has looked at his whole life and is currently forcing himself to believe he will keep looking at it. Caleb sat down on the step. Neither of them spoke for a moment. You heard about the surveyor, Walter said. Yes. He's a fool Hayes is paying to be brave, Walter said. I know that. I've met his kind before. He paused. It's still hard to hear. Yes, sir. I know it is. 30 years, Walter said. This place. 30 years. He didn't say it with self-pity. He said it like a man counting something real, the weight of actual time, actual work, actual living. My wife is buried here. My daughter grew up here. I built every fence post on this property with my own hands. He stopped. The idea that a man like Hayes can sit in a saloon and say, he stopped again. He can say it, Caleb said. He can't take it. Walter looked at him. The federal tribunal is in 14 days, Caleb said. Birch has the full documentation, the corroborating testimony from 3 additional properties, and now Horace Gentry's early survey records that predate Hayes's first false filing by 6 years. He paused. The claim will fail. The obstruction charge will be dismissed. The tribunal will proceed. You sound very certain. I am very certain. Walter was quiet for a moment. Why? In my experience, certainty is a thing you earn, not a thing you feel. Caleb thought about that honestly before he answered. Because I've looked at the evidence, he said. All of it. And I'm not a man who tells people what they want to hear. You know that about me by now. Walter looked at him for a long time. The ridge was going gold in the late afternoon light. A hawk circled the same thermal it always circled. Yes, Walter said finally. I do know that about you. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said without preamble, without warmth, in the plain, direct way of a man who had decided to say something and was going to say it simply, I want you to stay. After this is settled, whatever you want to call it, hired hand partner, whatever arrangement suits you both. He paused. I think you know what I'm saying. Caleb looked at his boots. Mr. Bennett, he said, I told your daughter the first time I met her that I had no land, no money, and no name worth speaking. I know what you told her. I meant it. I know you meant it. Walter's voice was steady. I also know that a man's character isn't what he has. It's what he does when having nothing would be a reasonable excuse to do nothing. He looked at Caleb directly. You don't make excuses, you just do the work. Caleb was quiet. She makes her own decisions, Walter said. I'm not speaking for her. I'm speaking for myself. He pulled the blanket tighter across his lap. I'm a sick man. I don't have the luxury of being indirect about the things that matter. Caleb thought about that. He thought about 11 years of moving and not attaching, and telling himself that was a choice rather than a habit born from grief. He thought about a woman who cross-referenced land documents alone for 3 months because she didn't trust anyone else to do it right. I hear you, sir, he said. That's all I'm asking, Walter said. He turned back to the ridge. Caleb sat on the step for another moment in the summer evening, with the weight of 14 days between here and what came next, sitting in his chest like a stone he had been carrying long enough that he'd almost forgotten it was there. Almost. He stood up, put on his hat, and went back to work. The 12 days before the tribunal were the quietest and the most dangerous. Hayes went silent. That was the thing that put Caleb on edge more than anything else. Not the continued pressure, not Dodd riding the Ridge Road, not the surveyor's noise in the saloon. The silence. A man like Hayes didn't go silent because he'd given up. He went silent because he was done making small moves and was preparing to make one large one. Caleb slept lighter, watched the ridge more, said less. Clara noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but he caught her watching him, the way he watched the ridge with a particular quality of attention that was less about what she could see and more about what she was trying to hear underneath the quiet. On the 9th day before the tribunal, Eddie Hargrove came to the Bennett place at a near gallop with his hat in his hand and his face carrying the expression Caleb had learned to read as genuine alarm rather than the ordinary urgency Eddie applied to everything. "They picked up Gentry," Eddie said, barely off his horse. Caleb went still. "What do you mean, picked up?" "Sheriff Coombs. The county sheriff, not Garrity Coombs. He rode out to Gentry's place this morning with 2 deputies and brought him in for questioning." Eddie caught his breath. "Something about the early survey records Gentry gave you. They're saying they were stolen from the county recorder's office." "They weren't stolen," Caleb said. "Gentry has had those records for 30 years. They predate the recorder's office." "I know that. You know that. Coombs is saying different." Caleb turned and walked to the barn without another word and began saddling his horse. Clara appeared in the barn doorway 30 seconds later. "I heard. I'm going to town." "I know." She came in and stood near him while he worked not in his way just present. "Coombs is Hayes's man. Has been since the county election 4 years ago." "Yes." "Going into town and confronting him directly won't help Gentry." Caleb pulled the cinch strap and turned to look at her. She was right, and they both knew it. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the saddle and his jaw tight, and the particular frustration of a man who understands that the correct move is the slower one. "What helps Gentry," he said, "is getting word to Garrity and Laramie before Coombs has time to build a case out of nothing." "Then go to the telegraph office first, not the sheriff's." He looked at her. "You were going to go to the sheriff's first," she said. He had been. "Yes." "Telegraph first," she said. "Then you can go wherever you want." He took his hand off the saddle. "You're right." "I know." She said it without satisfaction, just fact. "Go." He sent 2 wires from the telegraph office, one to Garrity in Laramie, one to Birch in Cheyenne, and waited for the responses with the kind of patience that felt like it was costing him something physical. Garrity's response came first, 40 minutes later, and it was short on it. "Don't move Gentry." Birch's response came 20 minutes after that and was considerably longer. Caleb read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket and walked to the county sheriff's office. Coombs was behind his desk, with the settled confidence of a man who expected to be in control of whatever walked through his door. He was a broad man going to fat, in the way of men who had been physically impressive in their youth and still moved like they were. He looked at Caleb with the particular kind of dismissal that was meant to establish rank before anything else was said. "Morgan," he said. "Sheriff." Caleb didn't sit down. "I'd like to know what charges you're holding Horace Gentry on." "That's county business." "The survey records you're claiming were stolen from the county recorder's office were in Gentry's possession before the recorder's office existed," Caleb said. "They're documented in Gentry's own land filing from 1851. That predates the recorder's office by 11 years. Coombs leaned back in his chair. "I don't know where you're getting your information." "From Gentry, who gave me copies of the records voluntarily on his own property without any coercion." Caleb reached into his breast pocket and produced the wire from Birch. He set it on Coombs's desk. "The Federal Land Office is aware that Gentry was taken in for questioning.
They're also aware of the timing 9 days before the Hayes tribunal. Coombs looked at the wire without touching it. You want to be careful, Coombs said, about making accusations that—
I haven't made any accusations, Caleb said. I've stated facts. He paused. The Federal Assessor's Office has jurisdiction over any evidence material to an active federal investigation. Detaining a witness who provided voluntary testimony to that investigation without federal authorization is a matter they take seriously. He let that sit for a moment. Garrity and Laramie is already aware. Something moved through Coombs' expression. Not fear exactly, the man was too entrenched for simple fear, but calculation. The particular recalculation of someone who had expected an easy play and was discovering it was less easy than anticipated. Gentry is free to go, Coombs said. He said it like it had been his idea all along. I appreciate that, Caleb said. He picked up the wire, tipped his hat exactly as much as courtesy required, and walked out. Gentry was in the outer room, sitting on a bench with his hat on his knee and the expressionless patience of a man who had decided to outlast whatever was happening to him. He was 71 years old, and he looked it in the way that meant he had actually lived those years rather than just accumulated them. He looked up when Caleb came in. They're letting you go, Caleb said. Gentry stood up with the deliberate care of a man whose joints required consideration. I figured they would, once they realized I wasn't scared of them. Were you scared of them? Mildly. Gentry put on his hat. I'm 71. I've been mildly scared of most things for about 20 years. Doesn't stop me doing what needs doing. He looked at Caleb. You sent the wires. Yes. Good man. He started for the door. Buy me a cup of coffee. I want to hear what Birch said. Capture. They sat in the diner 2 blocks from the sheriff's office, which Caleb was aware might be visible to whoever Coombs sent to report his movements. He didn't particularly care. He was done being subtle about things that didn't require subtlety. Gentry read the wire and nodded slowly. Birch is moving the tribunal up, Gentry said. By 4 days, Caleb said. Given what happened this morning, he considers Gentry's safety a material concern. He paused. The tribunal is in 5 days. 5 days. Gentry folded the wire and handed it back. Hayes know yet? He will. When a man like Hayes finds out his timeline just got compressed. Gentry looked at his coffee. He doesn't slow down. He speeds up. I know. You ready for that? Caleb looked at the window. Through it, he could see the main street of Silver Creek, the same street where this had started, where a man named Caleb Morgan had stood with his hat in his hands and said he had nothing to offer. Where the town had looked at him like the sum of what he lacked rather than the weight of what he carried. Yes, he said. He was not ready for what happened that evening. He came back to the Bennett place at dusk to find Clara on the porch, and the expression on her face that he had not seen before, not the controlled, managing expression she wore when things were difficult, not the direct, practical expression she wore when she was working through a problem. Something rawer than either. Something that she was working to get under control as he dismounted, and she wasn't quite managing it. What happened? He said. Hayes came, she said. He stopped with his reins in his hand. Here, in person, not Dodd. She stood with her arms crossed, holding herself together with a physical deliberateness that told him how much it was costing her. He came to see my father. Caleb tied his horse to the post with more care than he felt and walked to the porch steps. Tell me, he said. She sat down on the top step. He sat below her, which put their eyes at the same level, and she looked at him directly the way she always did when she was going to say something true and difficult. He offered my father a settlement, she said. Not a buyout, a settlement. He called it compensation for the inconvenience of the survey disputes, enough money to cover the banknote and a portion beyond it. She stopped. Enough to make my father comfortable, for however long he has. The last 4 words landed with weight. He said that, Caleb said, about however long your father has. He said it pleasantly, Clara said, like he was being kind. Her voice went flat in the way voices went flat when anger had nowhere else to go. He sat in my father's parlor and told him that the federal tribunal was going to be painful for everyone involved, and that a man in my father's condition shouldn't spend his remaining time on legal proceedings. Caleb was very still. What did your father say? He said no. She paused. And then Hayes said something else. Caleb waited. He said that sometimes the people who encouraged a fight weren't the ones who ended up paying for it. That sometimes the people who put others up to things moved on when the cost got too high. She met Caleb's eyes. He was talking about you. He said it with my father's name in the same sentence as yours. He said he hoped my father hadn't put too much stock in the loyalty of men who didn't have a stake in the outcome. Caleb looked at the ground for a moment. He was trying to put doubt between you and your father, he said. I know what he was doing. Her voice was tight. What I want to know is whether it worked. He looked up at her. Your father, he said carefully. Does he doubt me? Clara was quiet for a moment that was long enough to mean something. He didn't say he doubted you, she said. But he asked me tonight after Hayes left whether I knew what your plans were. After this was over. She paused. He said he thought a man should know what he was staying for. The porch was quiet. The summer night had the particular density of heat that didn't release after dark, just compressed differently. Somewhere up the ridge, something moved through brush, a deer probably coming down toward water. Caleb turned his hat in his hands once. I'll talk to him, he said. Tonight. Clara looked at him. The expression on her face was the one he had the most difficulty with, not because it was complicated, but because it wasn't. It was entirely simple and entirely honest, and it asked something of him without asking it in words, which was the most difficult kind of asking there was. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. Don't tell him what he wants to hear, she said. Tell him the truth, whatever it is. She paused. He's earned that, and so have I. He held her gaze for one long moment. Yes, he said. You have. Walter was awake. Caleb had half expected to find him asleep. The man slept more now than he had 6 weeks ago, which was one of the markers Caleb had learned to track without looking directly at. But he was sitting up with the lamp on and a book open on his lap that he clearly wasn't reading. He looked up when Caleb came in. Figured you'd come tonight, Walter said. Yes, sir. Sit down. Caleb sat. Walter closed the book and set it aside. He looked at Caleb with the direct, undecorated gaze of a man who had decided to dispense with the approach and get to the thing itself. Hayes was here, Walter said. Clara told me. He's a persuasive man, Walter said. I want you to know I didn't believe what he implied about you. I want that stated plainly. I appreciate that. But, Walter paused. I'm a sick man who loves his daughter, and I am aware that those two facts make me capable of asking more of a person than I have a right to ask. He looked at Caleb steadily. So I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer. All right. Are you staying because of the work? Walter said, or are you staying because of Clara? The lamp between them threw a steady, honest light. No shadows worth hiding in. Caleb was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer deserved to be said correctly. It started as the work, he said. I won't pretend otherwise. I came here because you needed someone, and the job was fair, and I was between things. He paused. It stopped being just the work somewhere around the second week, when I understood what Clara had been doing alone, and for how long, and what it cost her. He stopped again. And when I understood that your family was the kind worth fighting for. Not because you're helpless, you're not, but because the fight you're in is a right one, and right fights deserve people willing to stand in them. Bibi Bayi Omad. Walter was very quiet. That's the work part, Walter said. Yes. And the other part? Caleb looked at his hands. The bandage Clara had tied was clean and neat. She had done it without fuss, and with complete competence,
and he had sat close enough to smell the soap she used and thought about it afterward more than was strictly useful. "Your daughter," he said, "is the most capable person I have met in 11 years of working alongside a great many capable people." He paused. "She is also honest in a way that is—" He stopped. Started again. "I have spent 11 years making myself hard to know because it seemed like the safest way to live." She made that difficult. She asked direct questions and waited for direct answers and didn't look away when she got them. He paused again. "I don't know what your daughter feels. That is her business, and I would not assume. But I know what I feel, and I know that I would not be staying only for the work." Walter was very still. The lamp burned between them. "I have nothing to offer her," Caleb said. It came out quietly, the way true things sometimes did when you stopped managing them. "No land, no money, no name that means anything in this county or any other. I told you that the first day I sat on your porch, and it's still true." He looked at Walter directly. "I'm telling you that because I think you deserve to know it, and I think she deserves a father who knows it when he makes his own judgments." Walter looked at him for a long time. Then he said, and his voice when he said it carried something that Caleb would remember for the rest of his life, "You are the most honest man in Wyoming." He said it quietly, like it was the conclusion of something he had been working out for a long time and had finally reached the bottom of. "I have met men with land and money and names that meant things in counties up and down this territory," Walter said. "I have met a great many of them. I have known perhaps 4 or 5 who were honest. The way you are honest, not careful. Honest, not strategic honest, but honest. The way good ground is honest. It holds what you put into it." He paused. "What you have to offer my daughter is considerable. You simply haven't been counting it right." Caleb looked at the lamp. His throat was tight in a way he hadn't felt in 11 years. "Sir, I'm not giving you my blessing tonight," Walter said with the precise calm of a man managing the speed of a significant moment. "Because she hasn't been asked anything yet, and she makes her own decisions, and I raised her that way deliberately." He looked at Caleb with a small, careful expression that was the closest thing to humor Caleb had seen from him. "But I am telling you that when you do ask her something, if you ask her something, her father will not be your obstacle." Caleb sat with that for a moment. "Thank you, sir," he said. "Don't thank me," Walter said. "Thank yourself. You earned it." He picked up the book again, a clear signal that the significant part of the conversation had concluded, and he was now going to pretend to read until Caleb left. "Go get some sleep. 5 days is not very long." Caleb didn't sleep. He sat on the bench outside the bunkhouse for a long time in the summer dark, listening to the horses and the crickets, and the distant sound of Silver Creek running over its stones a quarter-mile down the slope. He thought about 11 years. He thought about what it felt like to be known, actually known, not managed or tolerated, but seen with the particular clarity of people who looked directly and didn't flinch from what they found. He thought about a woman who had asked him to tell her the truth, whatever it was, because she'd earned it. He was still sitting there when the lamp in the main house went out in the window he knew was Walter's. He was still sitting there when 20 minutes later a light appeared briefly in the window he knew was Clara's, and then went out. He sat in the dark and thought about 5 days and what came after 5 days, and the particular weight of a life that had been for 11 years deliberately empty of exactly the things that were now quietly, and without his full permission, filling it back up. Jab. The next blow came from a direction none of them had anticipated. Tom Aldridge, the first man who had agreed to add his testimony, who had signed the affidavit in Cheyenne, who had been the original second voice in the federal submission, came to the Bennett place on the 3rd day before the tribunal with his hat in his hands and his face carrying the expression of a man who was about to say something that was going to cost him considerably. He sat at the kitchen table. Caleb sat across from him. Clara stood near the window. She had learned over the weeks when to be visible and when to be quiet and present, and this was a quiet and present moment. "I'm withdrawing my testimony," Aldridge said. The kitchen was very still.
Withdrawing, Caleb said. Yes. Aldridge didn't look up from his hat. I got a visit yesterday, not from Hayes directly, from a man I recognized as someone who does Hayes's legal work. He stopped. He made it clear that if my testimony stood, Hayes would move on my property line dispute in the county court. Not the federal level, the county level, which Garrity can't touch. He paused. I have 3 kids, Morgan. My wife's been sick for 2 years. I can't afford a county court fight on top of everything else. Caleb looked at him. He looked at the top of Aldridge's head, bent over his hat, and understood the weight sitting on the man's shoulders, the particular weight of choosing between what was right and what your family could survive. He didn't despise him for it. Tom, he said. Aldridge looked up. The federal tribunal proceeds with or without your individual testimony, Caleb said. The submission has 7 corroborating sources. Yours is one of them. It matters, I won't tell you it doesn't, but it is not the foundation. Aldridge stared at him. You're not angry. What good would that do you? Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression shifted the braced quality of a man who had expected to be condemned and wasn't sure what to do with the absence of condemnation. Hayes's man said if I withdraw, he'll leave my property alone, Aldridge said. That the county dispute goes away. He may even mean it, Caleb said. Hayes is managing his exposure right now. He's not looking to add fights. He paused. But I want you to understand something. After the tribunal, if the tribunal goes the way the evidence says it should, the county disputes Hayes has been running go away anyway, because the basis for them is the fraudulent survey record. Withdraw or not in 3 days, you're likely to be in the same position. Aldridge stared at him. Then why? Aldridge said slowly, is Hayes's man telling me withdrawal protects my property? Because, Caleb said, Hayes needs to weaken the submission before the tribunal. And offering something that costs him nothing, or nearly nothing, in exchange for that, is exactly how a man like Hayes operates. The silence in the kitchen was very complete, Clara said from the window quietly. He's been doing this to all of us, making each of us feel alone, making each of us feel like we're the one who matters, the one he most needs to stop. Aldridge looked at her. He sent someone to the Briggs as well, Clara said. 3 days ago. Mrs. Briggs sent word yesterday. They didn't withdraw. She paused. But they thought about it. Aldridge put his hat on the table. He ran both hands over his face with the gesture of a man clearing something away. I've been afraid for 6 months, he said. I know, Caleb said. I didn't want to be the one who I didn't want my family to be the ones who... He stopped. Started again. My father built that property, same as Walter. He looked across the table at Caleb. I'm not withdrawing. Caleb held his gaze. You're sure, he said, not pressing, asking. I'm sure. Aldridge picked his hat back up. If Hayes's man comes back, what do I tell him? Tell him you've decided your family's future is better served by the truth than by a promise from Richard Hayes, Caleb said. Aldridge nodded slowly. That's a good answer, he said. He stood and put on his hat and shook Caleb's hand, a firm, deliberate shake, the kind that meant something, and walked out. Clara came away from the window and sat down at the table in the chair Aldridge had just left. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. 2 days, she said. 2 days, Caleb said. He's going to try something else. Yes? But we don't know what. No. He paused. Which means we do the same thing we've been doing. We stay close to the property, we keep Birch informed, and we don't give him anything that isn't already in the record. Clara looked up. That's it. That's the plan. When the ground is solid, Caleb said, the plan is to stand on it and let the other man wear himself out trying to move you. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, My father was right about you. He looked at her. You don't talk much, she said. But when you do. She stood up from the table. She moved past him toward the kitchen close enough that her hand brushed his arm briefly, deliberately, the specific kind of touch that is not accidental, but is also not demanding anything in return. It's worth listening to. She went to put the kettle on. He sat at the table with his hands in front of him, and the feeling in his chest that had been building for 6 weeks and was now almost too large for the space it was occupying. 2 days. He could carry it 2 more days. He was fairly sure. The last thing Hayes did, he did the night before the tribunal. Caleb found out about it at 4 in the morning when Eddie Hargrove hammered on the bunkhouse door with both fists, and the particular desperation of someone who had been riding hard and was still not sure he'd gotten there in time. Caleb was already sitting up before the second knock. He had not been sleeping deeply. He had not been sleeping deeply for 2 days. He opened the door. Eddie's horse was lathered behind him. Eddie himself was breathing hard, and his face in the dark carried something that made Caleb's chest tighten before a single word was spoken. "They filed something in Laramie," Eddie said. "Tonight, after the courts closed, a motion to stay the federal tribunal on grounds of jurisdictional conflict." He pushed a crumpled paper at Caleb. "My cousin works the night desk at the telegraph office. He sent word the minute it came through." Caleb took the paper and read it by the light of the lamp he'd lit. He read it twice. Then he stood very still for a moment, with the paper in his hand. A jurisdictional stay motion, filed in the territorial court in Laramie, claiming that the federal tribunal exceeded its authority over matters properly belonging to county jurisdiction and requesting an emergency injunction to halt the Cheyenne proceedings, pending territorial court review. It was in its way elegant. He almost appreciated the thinking. A territorial court motion filed after hours the night before the tribunal would not automatically stop the proceedings. But if it was accepted for review even provisionally, it created enough legal ambiguity that Birch might feel compelled to pause. And if Birch paused, even for a week, Hayes's lawyers would file 3 more motions, each one buying another week, each one costing the Bennett family money they didn't have in legal responses. It wasn't designed to win. It was designed to exhaust. "Who filed it?" Caleb said. "Firm out of Cheyenne, Whitmore and Associates. They specialize in—" Eddie caught his breath. "My cousin says they specialize in territorial jurisdiction disputes. They've done it before. Delayed 2 federal investigations in the last 5 years with the same motion." Caleb lowered the paper. "Is Garrity reachable tonight?" he said. "I don't know. I came straight here." "Wake Clara," Caleb said. Clara read the motion at the kitchen table in the same lamplight, with the same focused stillness she brought to every document that had passed through her hands in the last 2 months. She read it once, then she looked up. "Whitmore and Associates," she said. "You know them?" "I know of them. My father dealt with a property dispute 15 years ago before Hayes' different matter and the opposing party used Whitmore." She set the paper down. "They're effective at what they do, but they have a weakness." Caleb looked at her. "They depend on the other party not knowing territorial jurisdiction law well enough to counter quickly," she said. "The motion looks more powerful than it is. Federal Land Tribunal authority over fraudulent survey claims was established by the 1872 Land Grant Act. It's explicit. A territorial court cannot enjoin a federal proceeding authorized under that act." She paused. "But someone has to tell Birch that tonight, before he sees the motion in the morning and decides to pause out of caution." "You know the 1872 Act," Caleb said. "I've spent 3 months reading land law," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. This woman at a kitchen table at 4 in the morning, steady and precise, who had spent 3 months educating herself in the law that governed her home, because she had decided that knowledge was the only weapon she could guarantee herself. "Write it down," he said. "Everything you just said. Cite the act. Give me the specific provision if you have it." "I have it." She was already at the desk. "How fast can you get to the telegraph office?" "It opens at 6. "That gives me 2 hours." She pulled out paper. "That's enough." She was done in 90 minutes. 4 pages, handwritten, precise, and organized in the way everything she wrote was precise and organized. The legal argument laid out with the clarity of someone who had no legal training and had therefore been forced to understand the actual logic rather than the professional language that sometimes obscured it. Caleb read it standing up. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said. She said it without arrogance, just the flat acknowledgement of someone who had done the work and knew what the work was worth. "Get it to Birch." He was at the telegraph office when it opened. The operator, a thin man named Graves, who had seen Caleb enough in the last 2 months to stop raising his eyebrows at early morning arrivals, took the transmission without comment. It took 40 minutes to send the full 4 pages. Caleb sat on the bench outside and watched Silver Creek wake up around him. The baker opening his door, the livery starting its morning noise, a woman he didn't know, sweeping her front steps with the methodical rhythm of someone who had done it every morning for 20 years. He thought about what Birch would do when he received it. He thought about whether it would be enough. He thought about Walter Bennett on his porch, looking at a ridge he had looked at for 30 years. The telegraph operator leaned out the door. "Response coming through." Birch's response was 7 words. Caleb read them again, and then sat with them for a moment before he let himself feel what they meant. "Motion reviewed. Jurisdiction clear. Tribunal proceeds. Well done." He folded the paper. He sat on the bench for another minute in the morning sun, in the town that had watched him for 2 months like he was a problem that hadn't been resolved yet, and he let the feeling move through him without managing it. Then he stood up, put on his hat, and rode back to the Bennett place. Clara was in the yard. She read his face before he'd fully dismounted. "It worked," she said. "Tribunal proceeds," he said. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Just 2. Then she opened them, and she was back, practical present, already moving to the next thing. "My father needs to know," she said. "Yes." They went in together. Walter heard it with his eyes closed and his hands folded on the blanket across his lap and his chin level. When Caleb finished, Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Clara wrote the legal argument." "Yes, sir?" "At 4 in the morning." "Yes, sir." Walter opened his eyes. He looked at his daughter, who was standing near the door with her arms at her sides and her expression composed, and he looked at her for a long time with the particular quality of a father who is seeing in a new way something he has always known. "Come here," he said. She went to him. He took her hand and held it with both of his, a rare gesture from a man who expressed most things through action rather than contact, and looked at her with an expression that Caleb understood he was not supposed to be watching, and looked away from anyway. He heard Walter say quietly, "Your mother would have been so proud of you." He heard Clara's breath change. He went to stand by the window and looked out at the ridge and gave them the privacy of it. The tribunal was held in Cheyenne, which meant a full day's ride, which meant leaving before dawn. Caleb, Clara, Walter, Tom Aldridge, Horace Gentry, the Briggs couple, and 2 of the other affected landowners, 6 families in total, who had each made their own decision about what their property was worth standing up for, rode out of Silver Creek in the early dark, in a group that was quiet with purpose. Caleb rode near the front. Clara rode beside him. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. At one point, somewhere in the second hour when the light was starting and the mountains were going from black to gray to the particular gold of a Wyoming summer morning, Clara said without looking at him, "Whatever happens today, whatever the outcome, I want you to know that what you did mattered. What you did for my father, for all of them." She paused. "It mattered before today. It doesn't depend on today." He looked at the road ahead. "I know," he said. "I don't think you do entirely," she said, "but you will." He glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead, riding with the easy competence she brought to everything physical. Her chin level and her back straight, and the morning light doing things to her profile that he was not going to think about in detail, because he had a full day ahead of him that required his attention. He looked back at the road. "Clara," he said. After today," he said, "I'd like to talk to you about something that isn't the investigation or the land or your father's health." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "After today, he said again, making sure it was clear he wasn't going to turn it into something she had to manage right now. After today, she agreed. They rode on. Richard Hayes arrived at the Federal Tribunal building in Cheyenne with 2 lawyers, and the bearing of a man who has spent enough years being the most powerful person in any room that he has forgotten it's a learned posture rather than an inherent quality. He saw Caleb in the corridor outside the hearing room and stopped. For a moment, just a moment, something moved through Hayes's expression that was not the calculated pleasantness or the managed contempt Caleb had seen at every stage of the last 2 months. Something more honest than either. Something that recognized, without wanting to, that the man standing in the corridor with a group of landowners behind him was not the problem Hayes had initially assessed him to be. Then Hayes's lawyer touched his arm, and they went inside. Caleb watched him go. Gentry appeared at Caleb's shoulder. "Rattled," the old man said quietly. "A little," Caleb said. "Good," Gentry said, and walked in after Hayes. The tribunal lasted 4 hours. Birch ran it with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, orderly, thorough, immune to pressure from either side. Hayes's lawyers made their arguments. They were good arguments professionally presented, designed to create doubt and complexity around what was at its foundation a straightforward pattern of fraud. But Clara's documentation was thorough. Gentry's early survey records were irrefutable. The corroborating testimony from 6 separate property owners, describing the same pattern over a 3-year period, was the kind of evidence that methodical men like Birch built their careers on honoring. And Margaret Purcell's signed statement, delivered by a woman who was currently staying with her sister in Rawlins and who had been asked by Birch's office to provide a recorded verbal confirmation, which she had provided without hesitation, described a conversation that added intent to what the documents already proved as pattern. Caleb sat in the gallery and did not fidget and did not speak, and watched the proceeding with the focused attention of a man who had ridden a very long road to be in this particular room and was going to be present for every moment of it. Clara sat beside him. Their shoulders were almost touching. Neither of them moved away. When Birch read the findings, Caleb felt Clara's hand close briefly on his forearm, just for a second, just one moment of pressure, and then release. He didn't look at her. He looked at Birch. He listened to every word. The findings were complete and unambiguous. Fraudulent survey filings confirmed 17 instances across a 3-year period. Falsification of county land records confirmed. Coordination with county officials to process fraudulent claims confirmed. Damages to affected property owners to be assessed and remediated. Criminal referral to the territorial prosecutor issued. Richard Hayes sat at the respondent's table with his hands flat on the surface and his lawyers writing rapidly on either side of him. And he did not look at the gallery, and he did not look at Caleb, and he did not look at the 6 families sitting in the rows behind the railing who had come from Silver Creek to watch the truth of what had been done to them entered into the federal record. He sat very still and stared at a point above Birch's head, and Caleb, watching him, understood that this was a man who had just seen the full shape of what losing looked like, possibly for the first time in his life. He didn't feel triumph. He felt something quieter than that. Something more like the feeling after a long piece of work, the deep, uncomplicated satisfaction of a job that needed doing, done. Outside the building afterward, the 6 families stood on the steps in the Cheyenne afternoon, and there was some handshaking and some quiet words, and Mrs. Briggs cried briefly and did not apologize for it. Tom Aldridge shook Caleb's hand the same way he had before, firm, deliberate, meaningful, and said, "I'm glad I didn't withdraw." And Caleb said, "So am I," and meant it. Gentry clapped him once on the shoulder, with a hand that was stronger than a 71-year-old hand had any right to be, and said nothing which from Gentry was the equivalent of a speech. Walter Bennett sat in the chair they had brought for him. He had made the ride and the hours in the gallery, and he was tired in the visible way now, the way he had not let himself be tired in public before. And he looked at the Cheyenne afternoon with an expression that Caleb thought was the most peaceful expression he had seen on the man's face in 2 months of watching it. "Well?" Walter said to no one in particular. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. Walter looked up at him. "Take my daughter somewhere and have that conversation," he said. "She's been waiting for it with considerably more patience than I have." Caleb glanced at Clara, who was talking with Mrs. Briggs, and had her back to them, and had definitely heard every word. The back of her neck went slightly pink. Caleb looked at Walter. "Yes, sir," he said. They walked to the end of the block, while the others sorted out the arrangements for the night's lodging. It was a practical distance far enough for privacy, close enough to propriety, and they stood near a bench neither of them sat on, and the Cheyenne afternoon moved around them with the cheerful indifference of a city that did not know what kind of morning they'd had. Caleb had been planning in the abstract way he planned things what he was going to say. He had a sense of the structure of it. He was a man who thought before he spoke and spoke carefully when it mattered. He said none of what he'd planned. What he said was, "I told your father I have nothing to offer you. I meant it when I said it. I still mean it in the factual sense. I have no land, no money, no name. I am a working man with a good horse and a skill set that amounts to being useful in difficult situations." Clara looked at him. "And I am." He stopped, started again because this was the part that didn't organize into careful sentences the way other things did. "I am 35 years old, and I spent 11 of those years making myself into someone who didn't need anything, because needing things after you've lost them is the kind of pain I didn't want to revisit." He paused. "I wasn't expecting you. I want to say that plainly. I wasn't expecting someone who asked direct questions and didn't look away and organized federal evidence at a kitchen table at 4 in the morning and told me to say it mattered like she was giving me something rather than asking for it." Clara was very still. "I can't offer you what other men could offer you," he said. "I can offer you honesty. I can offer you someone who will do the work every day without being asked. Someone who will not leave when it gets difficult, because I have assessed the difficult, and I would rather be in it with you than be comfortable somewhere else without you." He paused one final time. "That is what I have. I understand if it's not enough. But I told your father I'd tell you the truth, and that's the truth." The Cheyenne afternoon moved around them. Clara looked at him for a long moment with the expression she wore when she was being fully honest, the open direct one, the one with nothing managed in it. "Caleb," she said. "Yes." "Do you know what I have been offered in my 27 years by men who had land and money and names?" He waited. "Arrangements," she said. "Convenience. Security of a kind that looked like a door closing rather than one opening." She paused. "I have been told by 3 men in this county that I was a sensible choice. Not one of them asked what I thought. Not one of them sat at my kitchen table and listened to me explain survey law and then said that what I'd done mattered." She held his gaze. "Not one of them rode to Cheyenne on a Thursday and Laramie on a Friday and sat in a sheriff's office at midnight because the work wasn't finished." He looked at her. "You are not nothing," she said. It was not gentle. It was fierce and certain, and it landed in his chest with the weight of something true. "You have never been nothing. You just made the mistake of letting the wrong people do your accounting." He was quiet. "Yes or no?" she said. "Because I am also a direct person, and I've been waiting for this conversation for 6 weeks, and I would like to know." He looked at her. The woman who had handed him lunch on a fence post and not looked away. Who had written 4 pages of legal argument in 90 minutes in the middle of the night. Who had said come back when he rode out and had been in the yard when he returned. "Yes," he said. She nodded once, with the decisive finality she brought to every conclusion that mattered. Then she stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw. One hand a brief, deliberate gesture, the kind that asked nothing except that he understand it was given freely, and then she stepped back. "All right," she said. "Let's go find my father before he exhausts himself trying to look like he hasn't been wondering about this for the last hour." He almost smiled. He didn't stop himself this time. They rode back to Silver Creek the following morning. The ride home was different from the ride out. It had a different quality of silence, not the taut, purposeful quiet of people moving toward something uncertain, but the settled quiet of people who know where they are and what they're carrying. Walter rode between Caleb and Clara for the first few hours, talking more than he had talked in weeks about the property, about the spring planting. He was already planning in his mind about a fence line on the south pasture that had needed attention since April. He was tired, and he was not hiding it, and he was also unmistakably lighter. At the midpoint rest, when Walter had closed his eyes in his saddle for a few minutes in the way he sometimes did, Clara said quietly to Caleb, "He's planning." "I know. When he plans, he's not afraid. I know that too." She looked at him. "You're going to stay?" "Yes." "Not because of the work." "Not only because of the work." She nodded. She looked at the road ahead. Then she said, "There's a section on the north ridge beyond where you repaired the fence that my father has been talking about for years. Good timber access, solid water rights, enough flat ground for a modest structure." She paused. "He's never done anything with it. It's part of the Bennett land deeded separately." Caleb was quiet. "He mentioned it to me this morning," she said, carefully neutral, "before we left. He said it was sitting unused and he didn't like things going to waste." "Clara, I'm just telling you what he said. You're telling me with a very specific intention." She looked at him. "Yes," she said without apology. "I am." He looked at the road. He thought about a section of North Ridge with good timber access and solid water rights. He thought about what a modest structure on solid ground could become over time with work. He thought about 11 years of moving. "Tell your father," he said slowly, "that I'd like to look at it when we're back." Clara looked forward. "I'll tell him," she said. And then quietly, with the particular warmth she kept mostly underneath the practicality, "He'll be pleased." Chatag. Silver Creek looked the same when they rode in. Same main street, same buildings, same faces. But the faces turned differently now. Caleb noticed it without making much of it the way people watched the group ride in 6 families returning from a federal tribunal, and understood without being told that something had been settled. Coombs was not visible. His office was closed. Dodd's horse was not at the hitching post outside the saloon where it had been with some regularity for the past 2 months. The general store owner, a man named Felton who had watched Caleb buy coffee and dried beans every week without acknowledging him, beyond the transaction stepped out onto his porch as they passed and said, "Welcome back," and meant it in a way that the words didn't usually mean. Caleb tipped his hat. He didn't say anything else, but he accepted it. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Territorial Prosecutor's Office in Cheyenne. Richard Hayes had entered into a negotiated settlement, which was the legal language for a man who had looked at what was coming and decided to stop fighting it. The settlement included full restitution to all 7 affected property owners, the permanent vacation of all fraudulent boundary claims, a substantial fine paid to the territorial government, and a prohibition on filing any further land claims in Cutler County. He was not going to prison. That had been a possibility, and it had not materialized. And Caleb understood that this was how powerful men often ended, not destroyed, but reduced, which was, in some ways, more fitting. He would live with what he'd done. He would know that everyone who looked at him knew what he'd done. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and said, "It's not enough." "No," Caleb said. "But it's what we have. It's what the law gives us, yes." She looked at the letter for a moment longer. Then she folded it and set it aside with the particular finality of a woman who was done giving a thing more of her attention than it deserved. "Alcott sent a letter as well," she said. "From Territorial Savings. The loan has been restructured lower rate extended term. And the board conducted an internal review." She paused. "The man in the loan department who filed the fraudulent review request has been dismissed." "Good," Caleb said. "And Margaret Purcell," Clara said, "is back in Silver Creek. Her husband resigned from the recorder's office. She's taken a position at the schoolhouse." She paused. "She came to see me last week while you were on the ridge. She wanted me to know that she didn't regret what she did, that she would do it again. Caleb thought about Margaret Purcell with her straight back and her prepared statement and the particular courage of a woman who had decided what she would and would not live with. "She's a good woman," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "She is." Yuck. Walter Bennett died on a Thursday morning in late September with the summer fully gone, and the first chill settled into the Wyoming air in his own bed, in his own house, on his own land. Clara was with him. Caleb was in the North Field when Eddie came to get him, and he rode in fast and arrived in time to sit outside the door while Clara had the last of it with her father, and then to be there when she came out. She didn't cry in front of him, not then. She came out and she stood in the hallway and she looked at Caleb with an expression that was beyond the vocabulary of composed or not composed, just the raw, undefended face of someone who has lost the person who knew them longest. He opened his arms. She came into them without hesitation and held on with both hands, and he held her back solidly, without moving, without speaking. Just present in the way she had been present for him in every difficult moment of the last 3 months. Fully there, asking nothing, giving everything that was his to give. He felt her cry once briefly against his shoulder. Then she straightened. She stepped back. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "He wasn't afraid," she said. "At the end. I want you to know that." "I know it," Caleb said. He said... She stopped, cleared her throat. "He said to tell you that he'd been right about you, and that a man's legacy wasn't what he left behind, but who stood better because he'd lived." Caleb looked at the wall. His throat was doing the thing it had done in Walter's lamplight that evening, 2 weeks after Cheyenne, when Walter had called him the most honest man in Wyoming. He did not look away from the wall until he had it managed. Then he looked at Clara. "He was right about you, too," Caleb said. "In case anyone needs to say that plainly." She looked at him for a moment. "You say it," she said quietly. "That's enough." They buried Walter Bennett on the north side of the ridge beside his wife, as he had wanted. The families came. All 6 of them. Tom Aldridge, and the Briggs, and Horace Gentry, and the others. And Margaret Purcell and Alcott had sent flowers from Laramie, which arrived somewhat crushed, but present. And Eddie Hargrove stood at the back with his hat in his hands and cried openly and did not apologize for it. Caleb stood beside Clara through all of it. He did not speak much. He was not a man who spoke much at events that required a different kind of presence. He simply stood where he was needed and was there. Afterward, when everyone had gone, Clara stood at the grave for a while alone, and Caleb waited at a respectful distance, and when she turned back to him, she had the expression of a woman who has set down something very heavy and is learning for the first time how to stand at her full height without it. She walked back to him. "The North Ridge section," she said. "Yes." "Are you still thinking about it?" He looked at her. "I haven't stopped thinking about it." Something moved through her expression. Not quite a smile yet. Something that was going to become one. "Come look at it tomorrow," she said. "Properly. Bring your eye for fence lines and water access." She paused. "Bring whatever else you've been carrying around for 11 years and thought you'd never put down." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They walked back to the house together, through the September air, through the land that was hers and would be theirs, through the particular quality of late afternoon that comes after loss and before what comes next. That still honest moment when the grief is real and the future is real, and both of them are present at the same time, and you choose, despite everything, to keep walking forward. Caleb Morgan had spent 11 years moving. He thought that maybe finally, in the way that things happened when they were right, rather than just convenient, he had found the direction worth stopping in. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.